Alright guys, today we're going to be doing a bit of an interesting topic, but we're going to be going over the teams who made the playoffs last year, and we're going to be discussing how likely I think they are to make the playoffs next year. Now, we're going to start with the Bills here, and it's not too easy to make it farther than you did last year when you're making the AFC Championship game, but at the same time, we're looking at it, they have an okay amount of capital this offseason. They have quite a few guys on some cheaper contracts, and the Bills should be able to make a better jump into this year than last year. Now, I'm going to put them make it farther than last year, but that's kind of or equal to. I think they'll be making the AFC Championship round, but I'm just not too sure. Maybe they'll make the Super Bowl. I'm not going to put them in the favorites category, but you just look at they have an okay amount of capital. They have some guys on cheaper contracts. Von Miller's contract a little more expensive for the player he is now. That should expire. At least I believe it does, but they should have some room to build. And considering they made it to the AFC Championship with a pretty weak roster, I think they'll be able to make it back there again or even to the Super Bowl. I'm just not going to list them as a favorite. Now, the Broncos, also, I don't know why some of these images are weird, but they are. The Broncos, I think they'll make it farther than last year. I don't know. Is it farther or further? Who cares? Same thing. Probably. But the Broncos, I mean, it's going to be, I'm not going to go ahead and start calling them Super Bowl favorites because Bo Nix at the end of the day is still a second year quarterback, whether he's going to be 26 or not. But they made the wild card. They scored a touchdown against the Bills. Then, I mean, it all fell apart, but they way exceed expectations in the first year under Bo Nix. Now, they have a decent draft pick. They have a solid core of players, and the guys they have to re-sign. Honestly, I know Nick Benito might need a contract and Jonathan Cooper, but outside of that, they're going to be pretty good on cap space, even with Russell Wilson's contract. I think they barely have to pay a hit on that this year. So I think that no doubt in my mind, the Broncos should be able to win a playoff game next year. I don't know how much farther they'll make it than that, but they will at least win a game. Now, the Buccaneers are a pretty interesting team. They did just lose their OC and Liam Cohen, but Baker will be returning. Now, Chris Godwin, I believe his contract's expiring. Chris Godwin's contract does expire. I had to make sure to double check, but they do have Jalen McMillan and Trey Palmer, and they could be a solid wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3. They still have Mike Evans, of course, who hasn't quite taken a step back that people think he will. So I think that they will still make the playoffs, I believe, or they'll be right between. They might just be one spot out. I just don't know if they're going to make it super far unless they make a couple good additions this offseason. And I like Todd Bowles, but in my opinion, the coaching is a little iffy for the Buccaneers. So I think it could be a pretty quick run for them. Moving on to the Chargers, I think they should make it further than a pitiful round 1 exit, but only so many teams can make it further. Now, they have a decent draft pick. They will have to focus on re-signing Asante Samuel Jr., though, and maybe Khalil Mack if they decide he is the way to go. Even with his age, he was still fairly productive last season, but I believe they can make it a game further, but I just don't know how much farther that is, but I believe they can win a game. Moving on here to the Chiefs, though, it's pretty hard to make it further because they would have to win the Super Bowl. Now, I think it might be a little short-lived, and that's not even hating. That's just this roster isn't super talented. Hopefully, teams can finally figure them out. And when I say short-lived, it'll probably be still the AFC Championship game. Now, I know putting them in that category, look, we'll bump them up. I think this category needs to change a little bit, but we'll put them right in the middle here. Look, now they have their own special little category, but they might even get bumped into the Super Bowl favorites tier because we're going to have one from the AFC side. Moving on to the Eagles, though, I think this team is so young, and I know a lot of people, they did just win the Super Bowl. No one really thought they would at the start of the season. Everyone thought they'd fall apart, which was really weird because I thought the roster was so good and talented. But in my opinion, they're probably going to be the favorites for another year. They're going to be able to retain most players. Saquon Barkley's still going to be there. Losing Kellen Moore sucks a little bit, but at the same time, 2 years ago, Kellen Moore wasn't the OC when they made the Super Bowl. But I do think that the Eagles have a very, very good shot of being able to make it back, or at least make another good run in the playoffs. Because this team is just so young. I mean, that D line, I don't think they have to re-sign anyone. Jalen Carter might be up for contract. I do know that Josh Sweat is, though, and so is Zach Bond, and they're going to be a little harder to retain. Also, you have a couple veteran players that might be leaving. Obviously, Brandon Graham didn't play a lot of this year because he was injured, but it sounds like he's most likely retiring, and who knows what Darius Slay's status is. But I believe that he's probably playing a couple more years. I think he said that in an interview. But I do think this team has the talent and the tools to be able to run it back again. Their cap space isn't too strict, so I think that they can still make another run and still give some teams trouble. For the Commanders, it's going to be very hard to make it farther than last year, especially when you made the NFC Championship game in your first year with your rookie quarterback. But at the same time, I mean, you look at the teams they played. They played the Buccaneers, who were a good team, but came down to the wire. And when they played the Lions, although favored in the matchup by most people, they were still a super banged up team. Now, I'm not going to completely diss them and say that they can't remake the NFC Championship game, but I think it is going to be hard. They do have some solid capital for this upcoming year when it comes to draft picks. I know they gave up like a third or something for Marshawn Lattimore, but they're still going to be able to have a bit of assets to work with. I know when it comes to free agents, they don't really have many players that they need to re-sign. A couple, I mean, Bobby Wagner, they might want to. I don't really know. He might be retiring. I haven't personally seen much on that, so I'm not going to sit here and talk about that if I don't know about it. But they have some capital. They don't have too many guys that they need to re-sign, and they should be able to make a couple good additions in the offseason. Maybe you try to add a player onto that O-line. But I think that they should still be able to make a good run. They have a couple draft picks, like I've said. I think one spot that they might need to look at is getting a better wide receiver too. No disrespect to Noah Brown, but I think that it can definitely get better than him. Now, Zach Ertz, they did draft Ben Sinnott last year, so maybe they want him to take over, but I didn't really hear his name much this last season. He didn't put up that many stats. I think he had less than like 50 yards. But they still did draft him in the second round last year, so maybe they still have him in the plan. So just having to see. I think they need to add to that receiver room, at least get Jaden Daniels, another guy, and you try to improve that defense some, but they should still be able to come back and make another good run next year. Now, we need to mix this up some here. So when it comes to the Rams, I think it's probably about time we might see them struggle a bit. It sounds like Matthew Stafford is in some trade talks. Some teams are interested. They're going to have to see if they can work out a restructured deal. Cooper Kupp sounds like he's going to be gone for sure. And obviously, Cooper Kupp, not as big of news because he hasn't been playing as much. But I think it might be time for them to do a little bit of a soft reset here. I think in halfway through the season, I was saying that Matthew Stafford will probably be moved in the offseason. Kind of sounds like that might be coming into truth here. So I think that they're probably going to have to do a little bit of a soft reset and try to restart the team a little bit, just because they've been running this core for a couple years, and since that Super Bowl, it's been a little shaky, a little rough. They did have a really good in-season comeback to make the playoffs this season, but I'm still going to put them as a bottom 10 teams. I think they're going to lose a couple pieces. Now, here with the Steelers as well, I'm going a little bit out of order, but that's mainly just because it's a little... we're putting a bunch of teams in the top. Let's start filling out the list. So the Steelers, I think they'll probably barely miss the playoffs. There's a couple teams in the AFC. I think a lot of the teams will probably run it back. There's other teams like the Bengals or even sneakily the Jaguars that might be trying to push for a playoff spot. But just this quarterback room for the Steelers, they couldn't get it done in round one. They couldn't beat good teams at the end of the year. And by the quarterback room, I mostly mean Russell Wilson. He was the starter. But it sounded like about halfway or towards the end of the season, the Steelers wanted to keep Russell Wilson over Justin Fields. Now it kind of sounds like they're not really sure if they want to keep Wilson. So I don't even know if they are really too interested in trying to re-sign Fields. But I think the Steelers are they're stuck in purgatory. They they can't get over the hump to be good enough to make a deep playoff run, but they're too good to kind of go ahead and go into this reset because they're too stubborn to do that. So I think they'll probably just barely miss the playoffs. I think that other teams will jump them this year in the standings. And I think this team's just they're aging, they're kind of mediocre all around, and we'll just have to see what they do. Next up here with the Lions, though, I think they will make it farther than the divisional round. I don't want to put Super Bowl favorite, but at the same time, I probably should. And I just don't want to put two NFC teams up there. But I think that the Lions will be able to make a pretty good run this upcoming season because they were just so injured, like I discussed earlier, against the Commanders, and their defense was really elite throughout the season, but you lose Hutchinson, and they were still even good after losing Aiden Hutchinson. They were missing multiple defensive starters and a couple offensive starters against the Commanders. And then Jared Goff in that game, he got hit pretty early and he seemed really shaky throughout the rest of the game. I still think that they can be a good team next year. The players they have to re-sign, Carlton Davis and Michael Davenport, Marcus Davenport, are pretty good, players on the defensive side that really complement the rest of the team. Kevin Zeitler at guard, he played some throughout the year, but I'm pretty sure he wasn't their main guy. So this Lions team, the contracts they have to bring back isn't crazy or anything, but there's still a couple guys they need to bring back, but all the key pieces seem like they're still going to be back next season, unless I'm missing something here. So I think they should still be able to make another good run. They should be a bit healthier too. Moving on to the Packers here, I think they should be able to make a better run than last year. Obviously, they lost in the first round, but this team has an okay amount of capital to be able to build the roster up a little better. I think a key for the Packers would to bring in a better receiver, a guy who can truly be your number one. Now, I think Romeo Dubes, whatever you want to say, I think he's still a solid wide receiver. And Jaden Reed is too. So's Christian Watson, but if I'm being honest, it feels like they have three wide receiver twos when it'd be good to have a truly elite guy or someone that's at least better than the guys currently in the room who can actually be a true number one wide receiver. Now, Josh Jacobs was pretty solid for them last season, and the defense wasn't too terrible either. Xavier McKinney was a very good pickup in free agency, but I think this team just has to pick up a couple more studs, or I guess star players, especially when it comes to receiver. Tucker Kraft and Luke Musgrave weren't a terrible tight end combo. I think you're fine running them back, but I think this Packers team can make a better run than last season. Now, this Ravens team, I'm just so iffy on, if I'm being honest. I don't really know if, when it comes to players they need to re-sign, there's not many. There's actually a couple players they can cut to bring in a little more cap space, but it feels like this was a pretty decent roster, and they just couldn't get the job done. I think they can have a good run next year, but I'm just not too sure how far they'll make it. It might even be a bit short-lived because only so many teams can make another step next season. So I think the Ravens, it's just the roster isn't elite by any means. I mean, they have talent, but I think they could use a couple more complementary pieces along the defense. And I mean, I just don't know, how much would they benefit from having a truly number one receiver with Lamar Jackson's play style, like a guy that's elite, because I think Zay Flowers can kind of become that, but I just don't know if his stats will really reflect it because of the team's run heaviness and Lamar's ability to run. When you look at the Packers, Jordan Love is a bit more of a gunslinger, so he could use a elite deep ball wide receiver, but I just don't know if it benefits Lamar Jackson as much as it would a Jordan Love. So when it comes to the Ravens, I think you kind of have to shake up the team a little bit. And no, that doesn't mean I'm not insinuating trading Zay Flowers right now at all. I just mean somewhere along the roster, I think you have to shake it up some. You have to give it a little bit of a newer look just to try to get over the hump. The Bills did that last season. They let Stephon Diggs go. They traded him. They shook up the defense some, and they made some addition by subtraction. I think the Ravens could follow in the footsteps of the Bills a little bit and do the same thing next season because it worked decent for the Bills. It should be able to work all right for the Ravens too. Obviously, it's not always how that works, but we see sometimes this can be a little bit of a copycat league where stuff works for this team, so other teams will start trying it. Next up is the Texans, and I think they can make a really good run next season. They're probably gonna let Stephon Diggs go. Nico Collins and Tank Dell will both be back, and they should be able to be a pretty good combo. The Texans will have their first round pick. Outside of quarterback, this is actually a pretty good draft class. Some people are saying it's a little bit weaker, but I think that's just because they're looking at the quarterbacks. They're like, I don't really like it. But this class is very talented, and there is a bit of talent down the board. So I think they should be able to get a good player in their 26th, 25th pick. And Joe Mixon was a very solid back for them this season. He was a little banged up some, but I think that this team has some of the fundamental players to be able to run it back. Their D line is not awful by any means. I think they could use another guy in the secondary, but at the same time, you have Derek Stingley Jr., so I just don't know if that's necessary. And maybe shaking up the coaching room by firing Ken Slovic. Can't quite remember if his first name's Ken or what it is, but firing Slovic, he was very good his first season with Stroud, but it seems like the league kind of figured him out a little bit. So we're just gonna have to see it, but I really think that they have their fundamental pieces now. You just got to build around it some. And I know it's just kind of a random pick, but at the same time, I don't think it's actually that crazy as some people might think. With our final team, the Vikings, it sounds like they're going to move on from Sam Darnold. I know O'Connell said something like he has the right to be a free agent. I could see them barely missing the playoffs or being a bottom 10 team. Maybe right between that. He can go in whichever one that you want him to. But I do think that this team they'll still show flashes. They still have Justin Jefferson. But if you're going to sit here and adjust to a rookie quarterback, there's still going to be growing pains because at the end of the day, J.J. McCarthy is a rookie next season. So I think this team's just going to go through the growing pains. And I know that these other quarterbacks were rookies last season and they made the playoffs. But J.J. McCarthy sitting a year, as much film as you can watch, there's nothing compared to really playing the game to grow as a younger quarterback in the league. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed it, like, subscribe. I hope you guys want to come back for more. Thank you all for tuning in.